Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Cybersecurity Recruiter podcast. Today, I'm joined by Devin. Devin, how you doing, my man?
I'm doing great, and I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks for joining. For everyone listening, me and Devin have just been indulging in a bit of soccer, football conversation, and I haven't got a lot of knowledge. And Devin freely admits he hasn't either. But I think we've managed to actually hold a manly conversation about soccer together, my friend, didn't we?
I'm not always the best at that with sports, but I think we did. We made at least one good sports person out of
Yeah, I look the part when I go and watch it, but honestly, I can't explain the offside rule. I can't tell you who's winning the Premier League or whatever it's called these days. But yeah, I'll go and enjoy it. And it sounds to me like your wife probably knows more than me and you put
yeah.
together, my friend.
She's the one that gives me all my information, so get it all from her and just parrot what she says.
Yeah, cool. I'm going to do you an intro for the listeners, Devin, that don't know you. Devin Lukomski started off back in the day. You were in the New Mexico National Guard. You were also a company fire support officer, then progressed on to field artillery platoon leader. Then you were a program manager for the 30th Field Artillery Regiment. You were then a chief current operations and cyber electromagnetic activities chief in the 4th Infantry. You were then in the US Army as a cyber and electromagnetic activities chief. And currently you are at OTM Cyber. Started off as a operations and strategy intern. You then progressed on to a director of strategy and operations, and you're currently the COO. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much. That all makes it sound like I've done a lot of lofty things than I think, but appreciate that intro.
Yeah, no, it's good, and it'd be nice to talk about what you get up to, what's going on today, and stuff like that. It might be nice to talk about that, like your progression, and probably how the army, I'm imagining, giving you that discipline to like really kick on and move forward and stuff like that. But and I start where I always start, which is, I know I've done you a bit of an intro. I can never do it as well as you. It'd be nice to hear who you are and what you get up to, and what you've been up to professionally, and what's going on your side, my friend.
Yeah, of course. And I do appreciate that. So, yeah, like you mentioned, and we're reading through there, I came from a military career. I enlisted in the Army straight out of high school, and I was enlisted for a short time and then transitioned to being an officer for the remainder of my career. About 14 years total in the military. And then, tail end of that, which was only a couple years ago in 2022, made the transition from military life to where I am now, which is an OTM Cyber, as you mentioned, as the COO. And I'm just a chief of staff. We're a really small company. It's that startup life you hear probably a lot of folks describe, especially within the tech industry, where you're wearing a lot of hats. Everybody's wearing a lot of hats. There's lots of different things that need to be done. You just need folks that are willing to jump in and solve problems. And thankfully, I'm part of a team that has a lot of those folks. And it's been a lot of fun. But really, I just run the business for the CEO. He's the tech mastermind and the guy that founded this whole thing. So he focuses on the technology as well as those big CEO things, outreach and things like that, partnerships at the strategic level. And yeah, the military really gave me my base for just being a professional and getting myself organized. And I think we'll talk a little bit about it too, I'm sure, as we go through this, developing some of those soft skills in a really effective and observable way that allowed me to transition into this role. Even though, for instance, I didn't have a degree in cybersecurity, I didn't have a degree in business. My degree is in criminology from the University of New Mexico. So it's not like I'm going down that path, so to speak. I think it prepared me well to do a lot of different things. And I'm sure we'll get into maybe some more details about that and stuff.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, it's interesting picking up on the discipline thing. I listen to a lot of podcasts about successful recruiters and successful people in general and stuff like that, and so much of it is about discipline and patience and doing the right thing. And you mentioned there about the CEO developing partnerships and you guys and girls developing partnerships, and so much of it. Like, I think people are looking for like that quick fix or that quick win, and you mentioned soft skills as well. And I think a lot of it is just about just doing things right, being disciplined, showing up, doing what you say you're going to do, being consistent and just really doing. Some of it might sound boring to some people, but if you do that well over a long period of time, it gets results, doesn't it? It wins relationships, it wins business, and it gets you moving forward in your career, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I'm probably not saying anything that a lot of people that have been in business for a long time don't already know. But, and the slow and methodical approach is going to pay off, like you just mentioned. And I think what we see a lot of times, especially in tech nowadays, is the perception that you can have a great idea. You can jump in, get a bunch of money, startup capital. VC is going to love your idea. They're going to pass you just millions of dollars. You're going to have everything you need to finance this, get it rolling. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes there are those awesome ideas and the stars align and things go that way and it all happens really quickly and it's amazing for those folks. And there's plenty of successful folks that have had that happen. But what I would say is, I believe that the majority of folks, that is not the case. You're starting the small business route. You're starting based off of money that maybe you and some professional partners that you might have had within your own professional network had. And that's not, most times, it's not going to be millions upon millions of dollars. You're going in, you're starting this thing very small, one or two people in some cases, and then you're slowly growing it. And that's where that patience pays off, and that idea that it's not going to be immediate and you're going to face ups and downs along the way. There's going to be times when your startup or when your business is living paycheck to paycheck, so to speak. If you're, and I would, what I would say too is if you're doing things right, you'll be living paycheck to paycheck, because all that money that, when you do turn a profit, when you do get some extra money, it's all going back into the business to try and scale and continue moving things forward.
Yeah, definitely. I saw something recently by this motivational guy, and he was saying if you can wait a year, you'll probably be way further on than most people. If you can slum it for a year and just really put everyone else first and do right, you'll do pretty well. Then if you can wait 4 or 5 years, you're going to do exceptional. And he was like, if you can wait 10, and he was talking about going up, and I think it's like if you can wait 30, 40 years, you'll probably change the world. But it's just like delayed gratification. And I think hearing as well, like Delvin, hearing you talk about waiting around for stuff, living paycheck to every successful business person, C-suite person, anyone I've had on who's done well, they all talk about not just living paycheck to paycheck. A lot of people talk about getting to Wednesday, having payroll to pay on the Friday, and literally not working out how they're going to do it. And that's not like a rare thing to talk about. And it's nice to hear people vocalize these things, though, because everyone's going through their own relative version of that, whether it's running a business, whether they've been laid off and they're trying to get back on the jobs market, or whether they're just trying to, everyone's going through something. So it's nice to hear you vocalize it. Do you find when you're in those stressful situations, do you find that tough? Do you have any kind of like mental mindset coping mechanisms that you go to that help you push on and help your career progressions to keep moving forward?
Yeah, so I will say it is tough. What I will say is that nothing though gets my blood pressure up like my career in my military. That really did prepare me for dealing with high stress situations. Even my worst days in doing what I'm doing now are not that bad by comparison. One of the challenges is that the military is inherently a hard place. It's just the way it is. You're wet, and that can be hard in the sense of inconvenience to you and your family, or that can be hard in the most real sense, like war is hell and those kinds of things. But it does build in some resiliency. And one of my challenges, I think personally, has been in the military. I was surrounded by other people that had at least a baseline level of that resiliency. Now that I'm out of the military, that's not, that uniform baseline isn't so much there. So it's, when you're talking about the situation, am I going to make payroll coming up this next week? It's keeping everybody else calm, keeping the team held together and things like that. I'm not saying everybody's running around with their hair on fire by any means. And plenty of people deal completely adequately with stress, but you do see a bigger variation. And I'm just saying that's been one of my personal challenges, is dealing with that variation and working through that in my own kind of leadership journey and development.
Yeah, no, cool, Darwin. Thanks, mate. So it's really for people that haven't been in the military, you're essentially like you're leveraging your background, which is enabling you to keep things in perspective. Like you go, and this isn't as high pressurized as that day when this was happening. So you're just always trying to keep things in perspective and not try and get too wrapped up in anything in the here and now. Would that be a
Yeah,
nice way to
that
put it? Yeah.
that that does. I think that adequately sums it up. Is maybe there's a built-in level of being able to do just that. Take a step back and say, okay, you compared to everything else, that every other bit of stimulus that this business currently has going on, how bad is
Mm.
this one thing? How bad are they collectively? But yeah, you're absolutely right. Perspective is a huge part of that. It's a really good observation.
Cool. I've asked this before. I've asked this on this pod before, but I'll ask, do you ever meditate?
I,
Yeah.
I don't buy like any traditional definition. If I
Okay.
do, it's not. I don't know that I'm doing it. I'll
Yeah. Okay. Because what you're talking about there, it's I get really good with it, and I do it every day, and then I drop off, then I get stressed, then I start doing it again. So I'm on and off with it, but it does what you're describing. It basically just allows you to keep things in perspective. Like Ray Dalio, the big hedge fund manager, says it gives him like a helicopter view of his hedge fund and his businesses at all times, and it really does help you to essentially just take a step back and not take things too seriously and stuff like that. But yeah, it's good if you can do it. I tend to find it's hard to stay on it, but for people listening, try meditation. It's wicked, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. Everyone has their own little variation of it, which is cool. So it's like just
And
kind of
that's what I would say too, is a great point. If you, whatever your coping mechanism is, if that's you get out, if you were just having a day and you've got to get outside, you've got to walk around the building, if you've got to get out to your car and just sit for a minute, if you've got to just go grab a cup of coffee, like something to detach yourself a little bit and allow yourself to reset. It seems in that same vein of what meditation might provide for you. So just making sure you adequately find something to help you cope with stress when those situations present themselves. Really
cool.
important.
Cool. So we've glossed over it a bit about 10 minutes ago, but this transition, you've transitioned out of the military, what appears to be quite nicely, and then you've progressed really nicely in the commercial world. And it'll be nice to talk about this because so many people in security, cybersecurity, are from a military background. Like obviously, I'm talking to people all day, and there's so many people whether it's security engineers or whether it's people running businesses, whatever it might be. There's so many people from that military background. So there'll be people that will be listening to this, maybe transitioning out the forces into the commercial world, or maybe they're going through it, maybe they're struggling, maybe they're worried about it. Any kind of tips or thoughts or advice for people that are about to go through that or are going through that? Anything you wish you knew back then now?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is specific to security. And that's that I will say when I was getting out of the military is a bit of an identity crisis of sorts for me. It's the only thing I had done since I was 18. Came out of high school, went straight into doing military stuff. So coming away from it, I was like, man, I've always been a part of this bigger organization that prides itself on a higher ideal and things like that. And depending on where you're standing, depending on your perspective, you may see that as something that's like a sense of purpose. And I did. And so I was a little bit worried about the sense of purpose getting out of the military. The first thing I'll say is in the cybersecurity realm, the nice thing is if you're contributing to security, if you're contributing to securing something, ultimately, at least a little bit altruistic. You are working to help protect something else. And that gave me a little bit of a sense of purpose. It helped replace that as I moved out of the military. And specifically with OTM Cyber, the great thing is we do that cybersecurity primarily for 911 and emergency services. So to take it a step a little bit further, I'm lucky enough to be able to say, look, we're helping secure networks that are ultimately allowing folks to save lives and mobilize emergency services and things like that. So, one, I would say finding a sense of purpose in what you do and reconciling that is big. And I do think that's a little bit easier in the cyber industry. So, there's that. And then what I would say, just in terms of all those that are transitioning or are working on that, I know that it's a big time of upheaval and a time of a lot of change, and that by itself can be tough to deal with. And I would say, I think that the military oftentimes attracts folks that like to have things very organized and done a certain way and hierarchical and linear. I know that I'm of that nature, so a big time of upheaval and change can be tough. it gets better. You get through it. You get it done. There's a lot of programs and support out there for folks getting out of the military that help get into cybersecurity, IT, and tech related fields. That's the last kind of plug I'll put in there. And that includes Department of Defense skill bridge programs in the US. That's what I did. I did an internship through Skill Bridge, and that's how I wound up in the role that I did. Now, that was just right place, right time. But I was lucky enough to have one of those opportunities. Our company still does those internships for transitioning service members, whether they are from a cyber background or not. We've gotten plenty of folks that have interned as a security analyst that are not in cybersecurity roles. That's one option. And also, there's other options as you're transitioning out of the military that include specific just vocational training programs where they'll specifically allow you to go through training for cybersecurity. And it's all funded by the military as part of your transitioning process and everything like that. So there are a lot of programs out there. My advice would be make sure you're asking the questions, finding out what all the programs are and things like that. Think back to when you first got into the military and where you are now in your military career, transitioning out 2, 3, 4, however many years, the 10 years later, and you look back and you're like, man, if I knew that program was around when I got recruited, I would have done that. That's what I always thought with the helicopter pilot program. They call it street. And I was like, if I knew that was a thing, I would have just done that coming out of high school, but didn't know at the time. So think about as a little example and use that to be like, what questions do I want to ask about what programs might be out there? And you'd be surprised to find out how many there are.
Cool. Thanks, Devin. It's nice to hear you talk about that because the transition you've had out is really cool and really impressive. There's a few things that I'm like keep looking down by the way because I keep looking back at your profile and there's a few things that I think you've done that can really help some listeners that are transitioning out of the forces or breaking into security. I think it's really cool that you've transitioned into a smaller firm. That's something I would always recommend for people to do. I think it's like easier from a progression standpoint. I think you can get closer to different aspects and cogs within the business and stuff like that. I think it's easier to develop relationships. When you actually went from the US Army to OTM, how did that for people listening, how did that actually happen? So if someone's trying to break in or someone's trying to come out of the army right now, can you like get a little bit granular with me and the listeners as to how that occurred?
Absolutely. And it's going to sound, I want to be clear, this is not an indictment of any of the civilian staff that were helping with the transition out of the Army or programs associated with these things. I'm going to put that up front. It was a tough time. It was the tail end of COVID. So keep that in mind too. There were some resourcing problems that led to how this, and I say all that because I was working on my transition and there's a specific program called Skill Bridge. And the coordinator that worked on it had recently transitioned out of the position on the post that I was at, which is here in Washington State. And they had not replaced that person. So there were some hiccups in the process there. And I was like, I want to do an internship. Can someone give me some information about an internship? And I was that flag, sounding that alarm pretty loud, but I wasn't getting a lot of information. So what I ended up doing is I just went on all of the websites associated with those Skill Bridge programs because within Skill Bridge, there's some subdivisions. And there was one called WorkX. And I remember I was just going through the listings on there of companies that were willing to take folks on for internships. And I found one that was just cybersecurity related. And really that was all I was looking for was I want to go into something cybersecurity related because that was the role from which I was transitioning out of the military. I found one. I was like, look, I tried to communicate to the office and I was like, I found this company. I would like to move forward with whatever your process is for getting linked up with them to do an internship and was still having a hard time. So I was like, whatever, I'll just look up this company and call them. So found OTM Cyber's website, gave them a call. They put me in touch. And I will say there were some luxuries here because I was dealing with a small company, with a relatively new company, because they put me right through to the owner of the business with how small it was at the time. I explained, hey, this is who I am. This is what I've done. And I'd like to do an internship with you guys. And he was all about it. So I was working to get everything in place with the business side of things. So then I could just take a completed packet that says, like, this business wants to work with me to the military coordinators and be like, look, figure it out, but here's the company. They're ready to move forward. And that's essentially what I ended up doing. And I ended up going into the office and I was like, look, this is my timeline. And it was like a soldier working at the desk too. And I was like, hey, man, I know this isn't on you. You're just doing this as like an additional duty, but I can't leave here until I have an answer on this. There in the office. And I think it was the director of the Soldier for Life Transition Assistance Program, SFL TAP. I think it was the director of the entire center came out to talk to me and was like, okay, come in my office. We're going to take care of it. Like I said, nothing disparaging against the civilians that were working in that office to help with the transition, because ultimately they went above and beyond to take care of me. They were just dealing with some resourcing constraints. So he took care of things. We got the paperwork all squared away. It was good to go. And then got my start with OTM Cyber itself, which I can elaborate a little bit as to how that went, if that's the route you want me to go, but I covered the transition itself, so I can pause there.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely get into to what happened after that. I'm so glad, Devin, that I asked you that question, though, because I think for the listeners to hear that, it's so valuable. And I think like certain people, this might sound a bit harsh, but I see certain like juniors coming out and they get some certifications, which is great. And they just expect everything to fall into place and happen from there. And it just, life just isn't like that. To break this down for the listeners, so you're on the SkillsBridge website. You've literally gone on there, you've looked for the list of companies, you've found a cybersecurity company that you're thinking, yeah, these guys look cool. I want to hit them up. You're thinking, what's going on? You've even tried to you've tried to go for official routes, realize it's not really happening. You thought, bang, I'm just going to get on the phone and call these people, which, by the way, I think, obviously I'm a recruiter, so I love this kind of thing, but I think that's awesome, by the way, because this is how life works. So you've got on the phone, the business is small, you've managed to get straight on the phone to the owner, which is wicked. You've then gone into the forces office, you've actually gone in there in person, you've ended up making it happen on that side of the equation as well, to the point the director of the center has come out, and then bang, the rest is kind of history. So look, you deserve absolutely everything you've got there, but it's just so nice for the listeners to hear that, because there'll be so many people out there that maybe getting some certifications, maybe sat on LinkedIn complaining, or Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days. But it's just that story. It's just the way to be, mate, isn't it? That's how to get forward in life.
I will say, I know that it can be frustrating dealing with challenges in the job market and getting hired and things like that. But it may sound cliche, but it's exactly what you're highlighting. Some grit really come in handy in getting those things done. If you run into an obstacle, you got to try not to just throw your hands up and be like, I tried. There's got to be someone you can call. But there was something a senior officer told me once in the Army. He told me about how he approached, especially when dealing with like folks that were just giving him a hard time at one of like some administrative office on post or something. They'll be like, the policy is you can't do that at this time or whatever it is. Something like that. That's an obstacle. And his question would always be like, okay, then who do I have to talk to for an exception to policy? And they would be like, what are you talking about? He's like, there's always an authority that can provide an exception to a policy. Just please tell me who that is and I'll work to talk with them. And little example, there's sometimes it's tough. Sometimes it's a really hard battle and sometimes it's hard to find that way through, but there usually is a way. I'm not saying that you're going to jump in at some really senior role making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, but some grit to get in there, find some ways around to talk to people, it will pay off. It will.
Yeah, definitely. I think the bottom line is why people don't want to do it is it's uncomfortable. Like getting that going into that direct center, ringing OTM Cyber that day and speaking to the owner. I know what it feels. I've done it myself to make different things happen in my own career, and it is uncomfortable. But I think for everyone listening, it's like you either take the discomfort like temporarily now and make it happen, or you end up in a longer state of discomfort from trying to put the discomfort off, if that makes sense. So it's just a case of pushing through and doing it forward. And the prize the other side is so good, like working in cyber, you know what it's like. The opportunity is immense. It's like really good fun, stimulating. It's bound to be hard, but yeah, mate, what a mega story. I really like that. I
Yeah,
really like
well,
it.
that's great. And what I would offer up too is at the end of the day, the worst thing someone can tell you is, and like their ability to, because can have a little bit of social anxiety when it comes to broaching topics like that with folks I don't know or elements at other businesses and things like that. Those things exist for me too. But at the end of the day, the worst they can say is no. And usually it's not going to result, even if you like jumped the ladder and talked like three people above the person you were supposed to, it's not going to result in them like blackballing you or something. Like it's not going to be like, this guy's on the do not talk to list. That doesn't really exist. So it's often worth just, trying to figure it out.
Yeah, definitely. What I think is if your intentions are good and you're trying to do something that's authentic and real and genuine, then you're allowed to reach out to people. If you're trying to do something malicious, that's something different altogether. But if you're genuinely trying to add value, move your own career forward, do the right things. You're going to help a business. That's going to build this. You're going to be providing, in your case, you're talking about helping out emergency services with cybersecurity related issues. So you're doing something good. And if you're in security, most people within security, pretty much everyone in the security community is of that mindset. So I think keep it in mind that like you're adding value, you're doing something good for society. You're allowed to push forward. You're allowed to maybe like not break, but bend the rules a little bit. And
It's a great, yeah.
yeah, push forward. And yeah, on the social anxiety piece as well, I'm glad you brought that up because it's sometimes I don't feel it, but sometimes I just really do, Devin. Like I'm just like, it's normally at the start of the week, I've got like big anxiety. And then as the week goes on, I just get more and more at ease. But again, it's nice to talk about it because there'll be a lot of it out there. I think, especially in the remote world, we all spend a lot of time behind screens, perhaps a little bit less time with other people than we would have once done if we were in an office. So these feelings of anxiety, for me, they're pretty normal. Is it the same for you? Or
Yeah, I think about it sometimes because I now being the COO of a company, I've constantly got to talk with folks I didn't know, try and provide value in conversations. There's a salesy aspect of everything I end up doing just to build a good name for the business and things like that. Naturally, those things occur and conversations with, who are part of much larger businesses with much bigger titles or similar titles, but their business has been around way longer and is way more established and things like that. I can certainly get in my head about those things and think like, well, this COO of this little company coming to talk to me and things like that. So absolutely, I have those kinds of feelings. And sometimes I wonder at myself because I look back again, reflecting on just other things I've experienced in my life, in my military career. I'm like, I've had to talk at the Pentagon. I've had to talk to House Armed Service Committee members. I've gotten blown up and shot at. And still in my life, I will be nervous about having a conversation with a specific person. I don't think it really goes away for most people. It'd be great if it did, but I think it's something we all face. And if you're just convinced that you don't, I just don't know if it's completely true. I think everybody gets a little bit of social anxiety. It just takes situations.
they do. It's like when you pinged me last about recording this, didn't you? You were like, see you tomorrow, mate. And I was like, oh shit, yeah, because we've been releasing them every week, but I'm miles ahead, so I'm not recording as many
Oh, yeah.
podcasts. And I was like, oh god, yeah, I've got to do that tomorrow. I was like, oh shit, and it does. I'm in it now, and we're doing this, and I'm like, I'm really into it, and I'm enjoying it. But before you come on, you're always like, oh god, and you do get those feelings, a bit like you mentioned with the customers. I'm the same when I talk to see if I've got customers that I've had for years. It's a little bit different because like there's loads of trust there and you all know each other. But when it's like new relationships, it is. But it's like anything. The more you do it, the more you exercise that particular muscle, the easier it gets, and you always feel great after. I find that anything what makes you feel nervous before, you tend to be on a bit of a natural high after.
Yeah. And I was, for one, that's absolutely true. And two, I was going to say that little bit of nervousness, that anxiety forces us to prepare and think about some contingencies, think about a little bit what's the worst case scenario, what would I do if for instance with our conversation right now, what if the internet went out, what are we going to do, things like that. Like it forces you to think through some of those things. So there's aspects to it that are healthy and help make us just good planners and build a little resiliency in our planning and things like that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Really, it's actually what makes us feel alive. I've had various friends over the years that have early on and then not had to do much, and they've absolutely hated it and got really down and really depressed. And it sounds like the dream to have a lot of success quickly and not have to do anything. It's actually, there's something about struggling and coming through a struggle and then doing that again. There's something about,
Absolutely.
as human beings, it makes us happy, I think.
Yeah, I think it does. I've thought about that for myself because sometimes I've thought about, we all think about the future, and I'm like, would I fully retire at some point in my life? Probably at some point. But like thinking about it now, I'm just like, I'd have to find something to do. So even if that's just doing something with my hands, selling stuff on Etsy or something, I don't know, but I'd have to do something. Couldn't just hang out.
Yeah, I'm probably the same. I'd probably like to work a bit less because I do absolutely cane it. But I say I want to work less, but I don't know. Maybe I don't. What would I do? I don't have too many hobbies, and I like working. But anyway, so you've come out. The director of the centre's come down. You've got the thing signed off. You've made the connection, and you've established a relationship with OTM Cyber. You've got in there. It's January 2022. You're an intern. What happens next?
Yeah, it was trying to figure out both between our CEO, Jamie, and myself, what would be the best way that I could provide value to the organization. And that's huge. Provide value. But we had some conversations and arrived at the idea that based off of my military experience, I would be good at helping just getting things organized than anything else. As that was like was the thesis of that conversation. Get things organized. From that point on, it was just up to me to figure out how exactly to do that. There was no prescriptive guidance for me on what needed to happen to make that happen. It started with like very simple things, and kind of some of it too was like seeing how much I could expand or feeling out exactly what my authority could be as an intern to determine policy or determine structure changes or determine things like that. And after a few small projects, Jamie pretty quickly was like, yeah, you've got free reign. Do what you need to. This is all moving in the right direction. Let's go. So it was really at that point helping transition the company from a small marketed via word of mouth business based off of a fairly small network of like previous acquaintances and acquaintances of customers and things like that to then scaling it into more of a expanding and growing business. So formalizing operating procedures, formalizing procedures, calendars, how are we tracking information, how are we managing projects, and organizational structure stuff. And what's the business plan? What's the pro forma out for the next 6-7 years? Taking on project, all those kinds of things were in projects that I was doing as an intern.
I need you over here, Devin. I think I need a bit of formalising of the processes, my friend. We're great. I'm a great recruiter, but all the other stuff goes by the wayside sometimes, which can be interesting. We have a bit of organised chaos over here, you know.
That's the thing, though. If your talent is the recruiting part, then you're kicking it in the butt and you're taking care of it.
Do you know what I like about at the start of that a few minutes ago? You literally, when I said what happened at the start of January 22, when you got in there, you went, I just sat down and I was like, what's the best way for me to add value to OTM? And for you, David, that might just sound like second nature, but I think that is the opposite way to the way a lot of people in life approach things. A lot of people will try and look at what's in it for them, or what can they get, or what can their pay be, or whatever it might be. You've completely reversed that, and you've got, how can I add value to the organization? How can I push this business forward? And that kind of mentality and stuff, we probably shouldn't gloss over it, because having that kind of attitude, obviously over a slightly longer term period, really not only helps OTM and is helping OTM, it's helping you and it's helping your career move forward. It's a good way to approach things, and people notice things. Do you think that's one of the ways that you've been able to move forward since you've been within the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was the case in my military career too. And what I would say is many folks might approach things and think about the idea of how is this going to be a rewarding experience for me, whether that have to do with work-life balance, compensation, or sense of purpose or like work be any of those things. It's not associated with just something that sounds selfish. It doesn't have to be that way. What I would say though, approaching it with how can I add value is ultimately looking out for yourself in the long run. Because if you demonstrate that you are someone who can provide value to an organization, you can then very easily parlay that into things for yourself, into things for your professional development, into things that might help with any number of those things I just listed: compensation, work life balance, things like that. If you demonstrate for an organization and for a team that I'm here to provide value, they're going to be like, this person needs to stay. They're going to say, and they're going to be flexible when it comes to what your needs or desires might be. So I would say that's probably like one of the first things there. And then secondly, as just a leader within an organization, both when I was in the military as well as what I'm doing now, those are the folks that come in and are just like, what they're reaching out and they're saying, what problems can I solve? The tough thing is, I think a lot of people generally think, and certainly earlier in my professional career, I was like this too. What are you prescribing me to do? What are the things that I need to do? And then checking off that list. And the idea is not to look at things that way, rather to say, what do I see that needs to be done? That might sound cheesy, but really it makes a huge difference in terms of the attitude and the approach, and I think in perceived value to an organization.
Yeah, no, definitely, David. Thanks for breaking that down, mate. It's nice for me to hear, nice for the listeners to hear. To start, you were like, oh, some of this stuff I'm saying people might already know and stuff like that. But I think it's so key for us to have stuff reinforced. I think we all forget about stuff, and sometimes we're bang on track, sometimes we're not. So it's like all this stuff's really good, and it's like any like relationships or sales. Again, everyone thinks it's this kind of quick thing you've got to do, or you've got to say this certain sentence in this certain. It's all, but it's not like that. It's just I know from the recruiting world, it's like you stay in the same spot for ages. You do right by everyone. You do what you say you're going to do. You perhaps even do something that people don't expect now and again. And all of a sudden, yes, it's longer term. Yes, it might seem harder at first, but it just makes the game a damn sight easier. The career progression game or the business game or whatever game it is you're playing, it makes it 10 times easier. And it's nicer as well, mate, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's rewarding and it's sustainable. I think that's the other part too, is maybe whether it's professional or personal efforts that folks might have in their lives, I think there's a tendency to burn yourself out quickly and then not feel like you achieved the reward that you wanted. So slowing things down, methodical approach, those things can be really helpful. And it just depends on what echelon you're talking about. That can be down to the individual, down to me being a security analyst that comes into work every day, or that can be at the organizational level where I'm talking about, okay, now I'm talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and what they're doing on a day to day basis. I'm not throwing all that money into a single effort. It might be a high risk, high reward situation, but that means you could disappear like that too. So
Mm-hmm.
that slow, sustainable curve is, I think, important.
Yeah, definitely. I'll tell you another thing. So I had I don't know if Jason from Spectre Ops, we've not released it yet, but I had him on last week, and he's like a pen tester, ethical hacker background, and transitioned into starting his own business. And obviously, they've made some mega tools. And he was saying, like, he gets really obsessed, and the team get really obsessed. But he says they do it in sprints, so they'll have 2 or 3 weeks where they go like really crazy, and then it's to the point where he's like pulling team. He's like saying to the guys in the team, "Look, come on, you've got to chill now." So they basically do it in sprints, and I quite liked that because I used to do that myself, but I'd almost beat myself up for not working harder in the when I wasn't in the sprint, and I didn't even class it as a sprint, if that makes sense. So if that helps anyone out there, for me, that's a really good thing. Go really hard for 2 or 3 weeks, like really at it, big days, and then have some days where you maybe are working 6, 7 hours
Yeah.
a day and cruising, and that's quite a nice way for me. I don't know if that resonates with you, Devin.
It really just depends what works for you and works for your team and your organization. The goal is sustainability in terms of what your effort is, in terms of what your payoff is, and things like that. And the way you achieve that might be in sprints, and that might be an allusion to the actual like software development project management, where they break everything down, and that's how they're like, this feature is its own sprint, we're going to achieve it in this amount of time using these resources, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different ways to achieve that. And yeah, sometimes the feast or famine lifestyle is what's going to happen just naturally. I will say there are plenty of times, I would say throughout the year, especially for me in my role as a COO, there are absolutely times when I am just like hustling. I've got tons of things that I need to do. And it just doesn't let up for weeks at a time. And then there are other times where I might have a couple of weeks that I'm in a lull. And for me, because of my role, that might be quite cyclical. At the end of quarters, I've got a lot of work going on. At the end of the year, I've got a ton of work going on, because it's all about getting plans for next year drawn up, budgets, all those things. But yeah, it's ultimately whatever works for you, your organization, and so on.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, mate. So we briefly talked a bit about communication and stuff like that. It'll be nice to. I'm imagining you're good at this, Devin. I'd like to get some tips on you about communicating to technical and non-technical people and articulating risk and stuff like that. It's a really valuable skill in the industry. I think on the whole, it's perhaps not talked about enough. I know when I'm dealing with clients at P level or C-suite level, like the value that people put on that ability to communicate with technical and non-technical people is an extremely valuable skill set. And I always think if you've got the technical skills or some of the technical skills and you've got those that communication piece, you're going to go a long way, especially if you combine it with some of the stuff we've talked about, relationships and longer term approach. But a bit of a long-winded way, mate, of just saying, any tips for the listeners on how to refine or exercise that muscle when it comes to communicating with end clients, both technical and non-technical?
Yeah, so I'll say up front, I absolutely agree with you. The folks that can mesh those two things together, it might be a little bit of an oversimplification, but absolutely probably have the ability to go very far within tech. And yeah, one of the examples I think about for this specifically is at the tail end of my military career, I was part of an organization that was doing a lot of new cyber related things within the Army. And one of the obstacles to the relationship between cyber as a capability within the Army versus all of the traditional methods of warfare that we're used to, like shooting big guns at tanks, and that the fact that it's new meant that your traditional military commanders didn't really speak that language. If I talk to a general who's been commanding infantry and tanks and things like that for an entire 30-year military career, and I'm explaining how I'm going about getting into a network and doing a thing, or even how I'm protecting a network, it's going to be pretty quick. That person's going to be like, man, this is so hard for me to internalize why this is valuable and why I need it. So the challenge was getting cyber soldiers to convert things to what we called maneuver commander language. And that was converting things into a way that a commander who was maneuvering guys with rifles on the ground was going to understand the value of how that was helping him get those guys with rifles to take the hill or whatever it was, for a rudimentary example. It's still something that the military is having to work through, because I think the military has great cyber training pipelines, but that soft skill is one of those things that it's not really in there very much. These guys aren't getting told, like, here's the way maneuver commanders communicate, here's operational terms and graphics, here's how you meld cyber things to traditional military terms and graphics. I say all that, say it's also in the civilian world, same thing. And that's exactly what you were observing as well. What you'll see is, what I'll say first is, it's all about your audience. And in some cases within cybersecurity and IT tech, your audience is going to be another technical audience. And then it's okay to geek out and just go hard and say, here's, I'm gonna do this, that, and the other thing, and use all the technical language you want, because that person's there with you and they're motivated by the same thing. They're also motivated by doing those technical things themselves. They might be fascinated by the ideas that you have. Where we run into the problem oftentimes within organizations. So, for instance, we do cybersecurity for 911. The decision makers in those organizations are not oftentimes the IT staff. Although the IT staff is going to advise the director of a 911 center on what they do with IT related things or network related things, they're not ultimately the decision maker. They're not ultimately the one that says, we get to spend this money on this thing. We need to make sure that we're adequately explaining how what we do provides value to that person. That's something big that I harp on for our analysts, as well as for the way that we write reports as an organization. Is our weekly reports are done in a way to summarize that information and just give, one, the bottom line up front, and two, how is that providing value to the organization? How did these metrics equal that your organization is better protected? The tips for that are exercising muscle, trying to think through, okay, if I say that I've got to isolate a device, what does that mean in terms of impact for this person? And usually that's the way I draw the line between the two. Think about what the operational impact is for the audience. For a 911 center, that means if I segment this part of the network in a high risk scenario, what's the worst case scenario? And does that mean my whole network goes down? Does that mean that only this part goes down? Does that mean that I lose the ability to perform this function, which is core to my mission? If you start connecting what you're doing to their operations and how that affects them meeting mission, those three things together, that's how you make that connection, I think.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. I'm just trying to make a few notes there as well, Devin, just to help the listeners. So yeah, so really knowing your audience, yeah, that's a massive one. And thing you said there, which was really cool, which is like give the other person like quantifiable reasons. Like you talked about, you used the word operational impact, like actually tell them how it's going to affect them. And this kind of brings us full circle back to seeing it from the other person's point of view again. It's just really being specific to them, telling them what's going to happen, and just breaking it down in a simplistic way for them. But yeah, it's a hell of a skill to master. I think it's something that technical people probably like, they maybe aren't very good at it because they don't do it too much, so they just shy away from it. But again, if you can just break past that discomfort barrier and really force yourself into refining this skill set, like you said, it's just going to pay. I mean, if you've got, let's say, technical skills, long-term approach, relationship building, and some ability to articulate risk in a clear, concise form to the right people, like you are like scary in a good way, aren't you, when it comes to moving forward?
Yeah, and I know that when we talk about it this way, it probably sounds easier than it is. And I recognize that. Like, these aren't necessarily the easiest things to achieve. And from someone within an organization, a leader in an organization might be listening and thinking, what's the actionable steps I can take to do that? And for that, it varies. But what I would say is you got to foster the writing skills that fit your audience's needs, which the starting point for that is probably, one, finding someone in your organization who might have a little bit of that talent, whether they're a cybersecurity analyst or not, and then helping them determine what a template would look like to get that kind of thing communicated appropriately for that audience. Getting some outside perspective is super helpful for these things. Going to the HR guy and being like, hey, come sit in this room with my security analyst. He's going to tell you a thing. You tell him what you don't understand about it. We're going to workshop this out. It might sound silly, but little exercises like that can be really immensely valuable for this kind of thing.
Definitely. I did a post, Devin, not to this, probably about a year or two ago, but I basically said, practice talking about like common SQLI or cross-site scripting or those common vulnerabilities that occur in webs. Practice talking about them to like your dad, your mum, your sister, your
Yeah.
wife, your husband. You get just see if they, because if they know what's going on and they're not in security, then you're probably doing a pretty good job. And you could actually probably have some, probably sounds a bit geeky, but you could probably have some fun with it.
Yeah.
Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
True. Yeah, getting people motivated and invested in the things that you like talking about. So what's not to like there? So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What's on the agenda at the minute then for OTM? Is it exciting plans moving forward? Is it all systems go? Or?
Yeah, things are really exciting right now. The company's just continuing to grow. That's always what we're working for, is continuing to expand, continuing to grow. We've recently done some great partnerships that have allowed us to expand client relationships as well as with those organizations themselves. And I would say one thing worth mentioning too is we're doing a big update to our analyst tools. That is all done, all the development is done in house. So that's probably the biggest, most exciting thing is the update to those tools with a lot of added capability and automation to help our analysts. It really increases analyst efficiency. So we're really excited about that around the corner.
Cool. Yeah, do you know what? It's like, I think this period of time will be looked back on as a really exciting period with just AI and automation. And I think like next 2 or 3 years, there's going to be a lot. It's not going to be boring, put it that way. I think there's going to be a lot happening in there.
Yeah, it's really exciting. AI and automation comes up in every conversation
Yeah.
days. You can't really be in tech without and have a big conversation without it coming up. And I think you highlight it pretty well. The fact of the matter is it's just going to speed up the rate at which things are happening. And specifically with the cybersecurity industry, it's going to speed up the rate at which we're developing protections, at the rate at which we can adapt to different threats. But the other side of that is, of course, that it works for threats as well. It helps them develop tools. Ransomware as a service is a big thing that's, I think, grown a lot since the dawn of AI, and we'll continue to see trends like that. So it speeds things up for both the good guys and the bad guys.
Yeah. Like I say, it just ransomware is like an industry of its own now. It's just
Crazy that you can
yeah.
create ransomware as a service as a concept is just awful,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Have someone who doesn't develop these things, but they can go and they can purchase it for, I got this tool for one instance of this tool for $40 and I can just hold something ransom. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it certainly makes the access to something so scary a lot easier.
Yeah, it does, and yeah, we won't talk about AI too much. I know what you're saying because everyone's on about. But
Yeah,
I agree. I think it's just going to make it more. I think whatever you're in, security, recruitment, and like I just know from different things we're doing this side, it's allowing me to do more of this: interact with people,
yeah,
talk to people, build relationships with candidates, clients, or whatever it might be, podcast guests, and it's allowing me to do more of the valuable bit the bit that I enjoy, and we're able to automate some of the stuff that I'm actually not very good at and I hate doing. And I think it's the same for whether you're a hacker or an analyst. I think you can automate a lot of the repetitive stuff that probably doesn't add that much value, is a bit mundane, and then you can do the like really super stimulating cool stuff. I think the only people that need to worry, if you were one of those security people sat back in 2021, 22, when the market was on fire and booming and you were just cruising, it probably is a time to worry, because I think those days are gone. So you've got to be
yeah,
involved and you've got to
that's
love it and you've got to be passionate. But I think if you're in it for the right reasons and you're on point and you're moving forward and you're passionate about what you do, I think there's nothing to be worried about. And in fact, quite the opposite. I think there's everything to be really excited about. I think day-to-day life's going to get better and more efficient and more fun.
yeah. If you're in it and you are willing to go back to the drawing board to readdress foundational stuff because things can be much easier now, then you've got the right mindset, and I'm sure you'll find a way to succeed.
Cool, my friend. Last question. I've kept you longer than longer than an hour, so I'll try and not keep you
This has been
too.
wonderful. I've thoroughly
Yeah, no, it's been good. I like the way our conversation's gone. We've gone on to all sorts of different stuff, which has been really good, and it's really relevant to moving forward and helping other people progress, which is what the show's all about. So it's wicked, mate. It's really good. But I used to say book, but it can be book or podcast or anything out there, content you're consuming that's helping you, that could help others move forward in their career journeys.
yeah. So I will say is I am not a great technical reader. I'm going to preface with that. Even when I was in the military, I was not the guy that was reading military history all the time. And even now, I'm not the guy diving into really technical stuff. I like to stay at the abstract. And frankly, I like to stay on the fictional side of things. So, huge surprise, the COO of a cybersecurity company is a big nerd. But what I will say is, in terms of a book, that I have two books that I'll mention that I found to be beneficial in my professional life is No Fear by Dan Abnett. And it's a sci-fi book in a series known as the Horus Heresy that some folks may have heard of. So in the cybersecurity sphere, I wouldn't be surprised. But The reason I highlight it is it's about resiliency in an incredibly tough situation. It's military sci-fi, again, huge surprise for me, right? But it's military commanders having to deal with a catastrophic invasion of their home turf, and then how that boils down to like leadership development to the end of achieving the need to the end of achieving decentralized leadership the occasion calls for it. So the ability for an organization to respond when suddenly things aren't working anymore because they've empowered leaders down to the lowest level. And I think that is really key in developing an organization, a culture, as well as young. So that's one book. The other one is still fiction, but it's closer to something real. So it's called Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next world war. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's if we were to go into World War III tomorrow, what might that look like? And I will say the writing is not amazing on it, but the concept of what that might look like is, I think, very accurate when it looks at like global supply chain and interconnectedness and what that means the beginning of a war might look like. And that has a lot to do with cyber and what in the military is called non-kinetic effects. So manipulation of cyber, political, economic, and like the electromagnetic spectrum to have a lot of effects isolating a nation or a target before those kinds of things happen. So it's an interesting one too.
Yeah, cool. That book, that second one, sounds a lot more relevant since perhaps COVID and since recent events in Russia and Israel, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
One of the things that I talk about in my speaking series this year specifically has been this idea of like warfare has changed, and how do we look at the incorporation of space, cyberspace, and electromagnetic spectrum as things that are leveraged in warfare on a daily basis and to achieve like political and economic goals. And that's why we see so much happening in this space right now is some of those things are motivated by geopolitical factors. So
cool. All right, Devin. Look, I'm going to say bye to you, but
sure.
mate, honestly, it's been a good one. It's been a nice flowing one. I've loved the way we've taken it. So love the episode, mate, and love that story. Thank you, mate.
That's great. Yeah, I'm glad you did. And yeah, I hope it's all beneficial to listeners. This has been a wonderful conversation. Really have
Yeah.
appreciated all of it.
Yeah. Cool. Brilliant, mate. Thank you, my friend, and I'll see you soon.